Kia ora, I'm Harv, Ian Harvey, founder of Collective Intelligence, and this is Stuff That Matters Now. No mai, hoki mai, everyone. Today's interview is fascinating for me, sitting down with a Māori academic who I met through a common friend, Tina Jenin, a few months ago. On the surface, Anthony and I are polar opposites, and yet when we sat down and started conversing, we both realised that we have so much in common. What I'm really fascinated with Anthony is that going from an unemployed young Māori man to somebody with a PhD in only a few years is quite extraordinary. And then seeing where he is applying his wonderful intelligence now in the world of Māori is quite inspirational, and this is work that's going to make a huge difference to the New Zealand economy, to New Zealand society going forward. So sit back and listen to a very unusual story and the work that he's applying himself to now. Enjoy. So Anthony, let's get going. Who are you?
Well, I use the expression before, closet academic, because I think for me, work life and non-work life have blended and merged together into one. So I never really feel that I get up in the morning and go to work. I'm so passionate, I guess, about what I do on a daily basis that there's kind of a continuity to that. And so my identity as an academic is hard to kind of place in all of that. What do I do? So I guess I am an academic, and that's certainly a reflection of the training in the later part of my career. However, an untypical academic. I don't work inside the institutional scientific system, the universities or any of the Crown Research Institutes. Instead, I work in a Māori community context, which I really love, and that's now the focus of my work. So when people ask me, what are you? So, and I think that question is a question we often ask in New Zealand society, because somehow our identity is tied up today with who we are and what we've done and what we've achieved. So that's our point of connection with other people. So I understand the question, but I always find it very, very difficult to answer that question because my work spreads across and spans so many different areas. And so I never really quite know how to answer the question.
And interestingly, it's not the question I asked you.
Correct.
The question I ask is, who are you? And we'll get to,
yes.
It's interesting, right? Because, and I know, and I am often wonder, does Anthony actually sleep? Because you do, you just, you are what you're doing, but I don't think it's what you do, it's who you are. We'll get to that later because that's a big, big subject. I'm really interested.
So when I introduce myself today as a Kaupapa Māori researcher. Yeah. Well, usually a Kaupapa Māori transdisciplinary researcher. The focus of my work is Māori community wellbeing and cultural survival. Most of my work today is based in a Māori community context. As I said before, that's where I really love working, and I feel really comfortable in that space.
Look at your voice go at the end there. It was just lovely just seeing how soft it was. It was just there. And your face just changed. There's a huge amount of, I don't think it's just passion, there's a whole lot of araha tied up in that subject.
There is indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anthony, the thing that, we've spent a lot of time together recently in the last few weeks, which I've really enjoyed, and I am dying to dig into where you've come from, your journey back as a youngster, because academia came very late and may not have turned up at all, which is ironic. So give us an idea of your childhood growing up. What was that like?
Yes, well, when I think back now, and of course my father had a favourite saying, it was that hindsight was always 50-50 vision. You know, when you look back, things are always much clearer, right? And when I look back now, I think I can see that my relationship with the education system was a very dysfunctional relationship. And that dysfunctional situation, I think, was largely a reflection of my home environment. There was a couple of things that were going on there. So, firstly, I was one of a number of children who grew up in a service family. So my father was in the Air Force. And as a service family, you typically got to move around a lot, which we did. And that included for me spending a couple of years overseas in Singapore, which was a fantastic experience and I think quite defining in terms of my identity. But the constant moving took its toll in terms of my educational experience. And one of the areas in which it took its toll was that moving from one school to the next, I never had the opportunity to settle into well-established and mature relationships with other people. So, you know, I got to know people only then to be moved on to, another situation. So that was one dimension. Another part of that journey was that when you're moving from one school to the next, of course, schools don't all simultaneously study the same thing at the same time. So you start at one school and you cover a certain part of the curriculum, you get to the next school and they're doing that again, or they're ahead because they've already done that, and so there's this discontinuity in your learning, and that meant that I found myself increasingly in really uncomfortable situations in the classroom where I didn't really feel like I understood what was going on, and then you have to develop coping strategies, to deal with that whole situation, which I did. So school, in the school environment, the stress levels were generally pretty high, and I found it difficult to relate to other people. It wasn't an ideal learning experience for me. Another factor that was driving this, I think, in the home was that, looking back now once again, I came from a home environment which was kind of a mixture and a blender, I think, of two things. I had an interesting relationship with my father. He could be an incredibly and wonderfully generous person, and he could also flip from that and, turn the home into a place of terror. And that happened, right from the time I was a very, very young child. And so I dealt with, in the home environment, with what I guess you describe today as domestic violence. I often think, we have laws against that today, And so not only was, school a difficult place, but the home was not the nurturing, supportive environment either that I think it ideally needed to be all the time. Sometimes it really was, and I just want to acknowledge that. I developed coping strategies to deal with this, and I think one of the long-term legacies of both of those two influences in my life was that I developed a very nervous and at times very anxious disposition. And of course that's because part of my coping strategy was trying to read situations to see where I was to make sure that I was safe. And then the slightest indication that I'm entering into a threatening situation, and, straight away that's going to, drive a physiological change, and I'm in coping mode. Yeah. So that was my very dysfunctional relationship, I think, with the education system. And I got to the end of my my high school journey, got through school certificate, of course, back in those days when we had school certificate, got to the university entrance examinations, and I failed those the first time round, and decided to leave school and to go out into work, which I did initially. Went out and got a job in the farming sector, which is where I initially started working. And in that job, I rubbed shoulders over the process of about a year with a person I built quite a close relationship with, and he was a vet. And so I was quite inspired by the idea of, working as a vet, and thought, well, I'll have a go at this. So I went back to high school the following year and had another go at university entrance, and just managed to get myself over the line with that. Basically got myself into a position where I could have a go at university.
Was that at the same school?
It was at the same school.
So that must have been pretty weird, having a year out.
And going back.
So you skipped your so-called year 13.
Yes.
And then you came back and you did year 14 as year 12.
Yes. Yeah. As an adult student.
Yeah.
At the time. Yeah.
Sitting in the classroom with other kids.
With other kids.
2 years younger than you.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. It was an awkward situation. But I think the thing for me was, I think I said to you once before, I used to go to school to eat my lunch. It wasn't a place of engaging with people in a deeply kind of interpersonal way. I had friends, but the friendships for me were always, short term because of the ongoing disruptions. So, yes, going back, I think I developed a way of kind of coping in which I kind of was not aware of things that other people would probably be more socially aware of. Yeah.
Did you have any sanctuary through your childhood?
What do you mean by sanctuary?
Well, just a place that you did feel safe and that you didn't have this heightened anxiety, or, a place that was, some people it's books or whatever. Was there a place that you would go or do, this was Anthony's place?
Yeah, I think probably retreating into my thoughts, I think was the place. And looking back now, that was an interesting experience in itself, because at that part of my journey, I hadn't, because I'd been so unsuccessful in my education, relatively speaking, I hadn't developed an awareness, I think, of my intellectual capabilities at that time. So I still didn't really know who I was in that respect. And my initial attempt at university was a bit of a disaster. So again, I left and went out working, and basically took up whatever I could find in terms of work, but primarily just worked as a labourer. As I said, worked in farm environments. For me, the countryside was a place of retreat, and I think it was helpful because I wasn't surrounded by those potential triggers, that I'd learnt to have to deal with, and that worked, I think, for quite a period of time until I got to the mid-1980s, and then I had another pretty big bump in the road, and that bump in the road was associated with the shift in political power in New Zealand between the outgoing Prime Minister of the time, Robert Muldoon, and the incoming Minister David Lange and Minister of Finance Roger Douglas, who set themselves to the task of dismantling what we called the welfare state and introducing a neoliberal model of economics in this country, which was a pretty radical shift at the time.
And the great irony is one of the most right-wing governments we've ever had, tucked up in the Labour Party.
Yes.
Bizarre, wasn't it?
It certainly was. Yeah, a shift from, the normal track in which Labour runs to the completely other end of the political spectrum. And I didn't understand that at the time. What I did understand was that, the work that I had depended on to support myself, now and a wife, all of a sudden dried up. And so I spent, with a lot of other New Zealanders, much of the time between 1986 and 1989 unemployed. Yep.
So you've got a wife, family?
Didn't have a family by that stage. I was married, and when I say I was unemployed, I did my best to find whatever work I could. but was unable to hold down a full-time permanent job.
Was your wife working?
Yes, my wife is a qualified teacher, so she took up work as well where she could find it. So, we managed, but...
And whereabouts were you living? What part of the country?
At that time, we were living in Rotorua.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, Anthony, I just want to reflect on this zone you're in, because I remember it very well. It was a shock to everybody. So how old were you through that period?
Gosh, that's a good question.
You'd be late 20s.
Yes, I'd been in my late 20s.
Late 20s. And because I'm just reflecting that if some things didn't come to play, you could well be a highly intelligent fencer now, still fencing.
I could be. Yes, that's right. That's right. I could well be. And this was where the journey takes an interesting twist, one that I certainly did not expect or anticipate. So much of, as I said, between 1986 and 1989, I spent unemployed. And during that time, trying to cope with the social stigma associated with not being able to get a job. And I look back today and I think that was really hard. I didn't appreciate the extent to which, when you're in that situation, that you have to deal with the disapproval of others, explicit and implicit, in the questions that they ask and the way in which they frame those questions. Why don't you get a job? And the issue was, looking back, you probably know this, that the Reserve Bank and members of Treasury, in their wisdom, came to the conclusion that the best way to get the inflation rate down in this country was to create unemployment. And myself and many other New Zealanders were part of the casualties, of the implementation of that policy.
That number was pretty high, wasn't it, in the end, as a percentage?
It was. And I didn't understand what was going on at the time. I think that was the real issue for me in terms of my adaptation to that situation. I kept thinking, well, I've just got to try harder and get a job. And of course, it just didn't work. And I think by the time I got to 1989, our first child was born by that stage. And I sat back at that time and thought to myself, I don't understand what's happened to New Zealand. This is beyond me, but what I do know is this: something has changed. And for that reason, and for the well-being of my family, I'm going to have to go back and retrain. And of course, I had a very dysfunctional relationship with the education system, and that was, quite a decision to have to come to at that time.
So just stop there. You've got no success in your back pocket.
No.
And for those who didn't live through that period, what happened was that the farming, which was a huge industry then, it's a lot smaller now, but it was huge then, and all the subsidies that the government piled into it disappeared, and farmers, some farmers went to the wall. All farmers became very, very cash. The cash just dried up. There was no cash. Borrowing money from the bank was just about impossible, and it took months to get a loan. To go through a loan process would literally take months.
Yes. And
everything moved very, very slowly, and just nobody spent any cash. Yeah, it was. So you've got no comfort there in that space, and you've got no track record of academia, but something inside you said, I've got to do something different.
That's right. So I tried first of all to get into trade training. And I thought, well, I've worked with my hands, so maybe I can turn my hands to being an electrician or a plumber or something of this kind. And unfortunately, the government of the time, and I can't remember now whether it was National at that stage or still Labour, had got to the point of restructuring the trade training sector. And now I was too old to go into trade training and to receive any form of financial support to actually be able to do that. And when I talked with the people at the unemployment agency at the time, I can't remember what that was, they told me that the only training option I had available to me was to go to university and to become a full-time student at university to train there, because you could still do that at that time. This was before user pays in education, and receive the equivalent of the unemployment benefit. Because I was a married person, then that would be the, unemployment benefit for a married couple. So that was a workable prospect, but for me, the idea of going back into education, let alone university, was a pretty big decision to have to deal with. And I did do that. In the end, I came to the conclusion that I don't have any other option. The option is do this and have a go at it, or face long-term unemployment. That's the prospect.
And your wife at that time, did she... Not your wife at that time, I think you've still got the same wife. Your wife, in that moment, what was going through her head?
I think this was a struggle for both of us, and we had very good communication over this. I think she was very supportive, and I can say that one of the reasons I am where I am today is because I have a remarkably supportive wife. She's amazing. So she was there and ready to support me through this experience of going into university. So in 1990, I enrolled at university and started my first year at university. I remember, turning up to lectures and then, of course, being given assignments. We had to go away and write an essay, and that was before the time of computers. Just on the time of the arrival of the personal computer was coming of age. But I started with the old pen and paper technique, and I remember spending hours trying to write assignments, handed these papers in, and then felt really disappointed with the grade that I was getting. Now, I had the foresight, thankfully, in that first year at university to enrol in a paper in applied English. And my thinking there was to try and just develop some confidence in writing to help myself through the rest of the year. And I managed to get a couple of really good lecturers in that paper. The second one in particular, a chap by the name of David Dowling, who was a lecturer in English. Yes, he had a remarkable influence, I think, in terms of helping me to develop the skills I needed to cope with and deal with the academic environment. One of the first things he did was took me across campus, sat me down in front of a Macintosh computer, the little Macintosh computers which had come of age, and these were the ones with the floppy drives, nothing flash. But what he was trying to show me was that you're spending a lot of time working on these assignments, but you lack the ability to edit them and polish them. And if we can help you with that, then you can work on getting your grade up. And I fell in love with computers straight away. That to me really connected and really resonated.
What was the degree?
I started with a degree in planning, which was resource and environmental planning at that time, and had papers in geography. I stayed with that, and because I'd had a former experience at university, so about 10 years before that I'd had a go at it and failed. I actually had a couple of papers, so I had 2 or 3 papers up my sleeve by that stage, and that meant that I could take some second papers in the first year at university as well in 1990. So struggled at the end of the year, struggled at the beginning of the year, got to the end of the year, and did my best with the exams, went away for the Christmas holidays, and eventually got the letters, in the mail. And I had really good grades across all of my papers, and also managed to win 2 awards, one for the leading first year planning student and the leading second year geography student, or the other way around, I think it was actually. So I got a couple of prizes as well. And I think that really helped to boost my confidence at that stage, that made me feel like, well, I think I can pull this off, and it's just a matter of effort and application, and if I continue to do this, I'll get there.
Which university?
This was at Massey.
And so you were living where?
We were living in Palmerston North. We had a state house, which we'd managed to secure. And, of course, that was back in the time when we had state houses with the nice low rents. So as a student with the unemployment benefit, we managed just. It was challenging and difficult, but, yeah, we made our way through that.
And so the grades, were they a surprise?
They were a great surprise. I wasn't expecting it. I had my wife standing alongside me, when I finally got the letter and opened it, and I was kind of, peering over the top of it, trying to see, what came out of the envelope. And yeah, I got a surprise when I saw them.
And I was going to say the rest is history, but it's not.
No, it wasn't, and that's because, I felt like I was only ever one step most of the time ahead of the changes. I tried to get into training. I was too late there. So I started with the university, and in my second year at university, government announced that they were now going to shift the education system over to user pays, which meant that I was going to have another year of university training that would be funded by government, and then after that, a change was coming. Yeah, and now I was really concerned because I had a partly finished degree, and the prospect of this forthcoming change in the funding situation, and still didn't have a job. So in my second year at university, when I came to enrolment, I went to visit the appropriate people at the university and asked if I could take extra papers in that second year at university, and I finished my degree in the second year at university and came out of the degree with good grades, mostly A minus, A plus grades. It was hard work, but I managed to pull it off. And left university and went out to look for a job, and I still couldn't find a job. So by the end of
What sort of job were you looking for?
Anything. Now, there was another change that had come by that stage. In 1991, of course, was the implementation of the Resource Management Act. I was working in a kind of a planning physical geography space, and my thinking was at the time that I would try and get a job in one of the emerging regional councils, that would be created under the Resource Management Act and work in that space. And I still wasn't entirely sure why writing job applications, it just wasn't working. It was partly there was still quite a narrow job market at that time, but it wasn't working. So the head of department in geography was keen for me to come back and to do a master's. And when I asked them, what's a master's? Oh, that's another 2 years. And I'd had a talk to some of the other students about it, and they said to me, well, yeah, it's probably 3. And I thought to myself... And expensive. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, well, I haven't got a job. Okay, so, this is probably helpful in terms of my job prospects. I'll come back and I'll do another year. So...
How many kids at this stage?
2.
Yep.
Yes. We had our second child, and I decided to go back and do an honours year, which is 1 year. And there's a little bit of an interesting story behind that, which is also, I think, a part of my emerging identity, bearing in mind very dysfunctional relationship with the education system and hadn't quite figured out who I actually was from an academic point of view. But because of the emerging Resource Management Act and hopefully the space that was going to create in terms of jobs, we were being told at the time, if you've got the biophysical sciences, a little bit of a planning background and ecology, that'll put you in a really good place to get a job in the regional councils. So I thought, okay, then maybe what I'll do is have a go at doing a degree in ecology for my honours year. So I'm a planning geography student, fronted up on the registration day to the head of department, and of the ecology department, and said to him, well, I'm a planning student, I'd like to do an honours degree in ecology. And he kind of looked at me a bit strange and he said, no. And I said to him, well, I've got good grades. And he said to me, oh, show me. So I kind of pushed my script across the table, and he looked over the top of his grades and he said, oh, yeah, maybe if you do some hard work. So the door was open, and of course, and I slipped. So I became an honours student in the ecology department. Got to the end of the first term, and I'm sitting there at home on my computer, bashing away on an assignment. The phone goes, I pick up the phone. It's the head of department. And he said to me, we've got a problem. I said, what's that? He said, well, I've just been to talk to the Dean of the Sciences at Massey University, who's told me that your enrolment in the ecology department as an honours student is a violation of the university regulations. You're going to have to pull out. I'm like, oh, you've got to be kidding. Yeah, and I look back now in this age in which we live now, and talking about interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary coordination of knowledge development. But that's where the university system was at the time. It was very, very territorial, and so the head of department of geography, who I'd got to know quite well by that stage, went over to have a talk to the Dean of Sciences, and then came back and said to me, "Oh, no, he's not going to move." So what happened was one of the other lecturers in the geography department came up with this idea. We have things in geography called special topic papers, right? And you can use a special topic paper for anything. So what they did was they unenrolled me from the ecology department and then re-enrolled me in the geography department under special topic papers, so I could do all my ecology papers and geography as special topic papers. Voila. And I finished an honours year in ecology with no actual academic recognition for it, other than the fact that I got through and managed to get good grades once again. I managed to get a first-class honours degree and again left university to go and find a job. Still couldn't find a job.
Andy, what's going on in your self-esteem at this point? Right? What's happening inside of you? Are any lights coming on, more lights coming on through this?
Not by that stage. No, I think this was still a struggle, and it was a day-to-day struggle. Yeah,
and so you
you said before, when do you sleep? Yeah. I think I developed the work ethic that I have at that time, and that was part of an awakening to who I was that I hadn't actually figured out. And actually, I didn't figure that out until about a year ago, and that happened when your friend. My friend, Tina Jenin, gave me access to a book called Gifted Adults. And I read that, went through that book a number of times, and what began to dawn on me was the realisation that I have, a giftedness that I didn't realise was there. And I certainly didn't see it back at the time. So, yes, got to the end of the school holiday, still couldn't find a job, and the head of the geography department was like, well, come back and do a PhD. So in the meantime, I'd also managed to join the selection for winning a Massey University scholarship, which gave me now 3 years funding to basically underpin the payment of...
Which is a big deal.
Because it was a big deal.
Yep.
Yeah, it was. And that was totally unexpected. So again, I'm at the end of the school holidays looking for a job, thinking, oh, not another 3 years, But having said that, that was a wonderful offer and something that I'd never imagined that I would ever do. I remember in my first year at university, standing in the hall in the English Studies department, with one of assignments in hand, wanting to see a lecturer to find out something about it. And I was looking up at the doors and the little plaques that the lecturers have on the doors with their name, doctor, professor, and I was thinking, man, what must it take to get to that, And now all of a sudden, here I was with the prospect of doing something that I never ever imagined that I'd really do.
And somebody must have seen something in you at that point, right? So they didn't offer you that because you're a nice fella, right? Because they've got so many resources to offer that to you, they want a return, right? So they must have seen something in you.
I think they must have. I think in particular Professor John Flenley, who was the head of the geography department, just wanted to acknowledge John. He's passed away in the meantime. I think John did see, he probably saw what I didn't see at the time. And that provided continuity in terms of keeping that journey going. And there was a high level of trust, I think, on my part that he felt I could pull it off and do it. Because bear in mind that's a huge step to go from honours, to doctoral studies. And what made it worse was that the area that I'd been working in, this is kind of a mix and blend now of the biophysical sciences and ecology. I had been working with Professor John Flenley using his skills in the area of palynology, which is a research method in which you remove cores from deposits, and then you sample and analyse the cores to better understand the change in vegetation over very, very long periods of time. And this is an approach to knowledge development that had been developed over a very long period of time. It was well established, but well established to the point that it was kind of stuck, if you like, in a stage of its development where it was really very narrative in nature. And to move it on into the development of theory, which is what I was really interested in, was going to require now quite a big step. And I remember John telling me now, because I finally got to the stage of, okay, I'll come back and do a PhD. And then he told me, well, if you want to carry on in this area, what you're going to have to do is to do some mathematical modelling in your PhD. And I remember leaning back on my seat at the time, you've got to be kidding me, right? I had one paper in mathematics at university. It was a paper I took in my first year. It was called Applied Mathematics or something of that kind, which I took a little bit like the Applied English paper just to try and build my capabilities in this area. And I think it was all I could do to get a C for that paper. It's the only C grade I think I've got in my entire academic portfolio. So anyway, he said to me, look, I've got a friend in the maths department who has agreed to help us, so we're going to have a talk with him. So he marches me over to the maths department. He didn't tell me who I was going to see. Turns out it was the head of the maths department, right? His name was Professor Graham Wake. And so I sat down with Professor Graham Wake and had a talk to him about this idea of what I wanted to do in the PhD. And the interesting thing with Graham was Graham's a lovely person, and I connected with Graham straight away at a very personal level. I didn't feel threatened by him. I felt comfortable with him. And of course for me that's a really important first step always. So we agreed that we'd have a go at this and he'd provide the support for me. And Graham's support was, as head of department, I think was really quite helpful because he had a lot of resources he could draw on within the department in terms of support from other staff members, which was fantastic. And I just want to say that when I got to the end of that 3-year PhD journey, I said in the acknowledgements to my PhD thesis that Graham had achieved in 3 years what no other teacher had achieved in a lifetime of education. He had unfolded in me a love for mathematics. Yeah. And that was quite an achievement, I have to say. So, yes, I spent 3 years working on a PhD, and at the end of that 3 years, I had this thesis which was coming together. I remember sitting with Professor John Flenley. When you're doing a doctoral journey, you get to this kind of interesting crossover point where initially you're quite dependent on your supervisors, and then you get to the stage where you start to see things that they don't see, and you have to then kind of venture out into that new area yourself. And I'd been through that change, but I think looking back, I'd really taken the field that I was working in a long way. Probably more than was reasonably expected, I think, within a PhD. And this created quite a bit of anxiety for me when I got to the end of that journey. Because bear in mind, I've invested another 3 years of study at university. I still haven't got a job, Harv. It's 1980s. I still don't have a job at this time.
I haven't lost sight of this. Yeah. You've still got a wife.
I still got a wife.
Yeah.
And, she's been through this, through thick and thin, kids in tow, and supported me through this whole journey. And now I've got this PhD thesis, and we've got to get it examined, right? So Professor John Flenley said to me, look, you need national examiner and then an international examiner. This is the person I think who should do it nationally, and I've had a talk with Graham about this. He thinks this is the right person. And the person that I think we should go for internationally is Professor Keith Bennett from Cambridge University. And, when he said that, I remember, the expression of horror that kind of came, must have been this expression of horror on my face. I thought, oh, good grief, no, not Cambridge University. And as I said, I still hadn't awakened, I think, to the identity of who I was in terms of that academic journey. So that was a very anxious time for me.
Was that imposter syndrome?
I don't think so.
No.
I think that just was a genuine failure to be able to see at that time.
Yeah.
It was a blind spot.
Yeah, because when I asked the question, I was sitting there going, what is this? It's just, yeah.
So the thesis went out, it got examined, came back, and I got called to an oral defence of the thesis, had to stand before a panel, or sit before a panel and to answer their questions, which I did. And then you have to leave the room and you go and stand out in a dark, cold corridor by yourself while they deliberate. And, that was an interesting experience. Got called back into the room and they said, okay, so here's the deal. We're going to pass your thesis. It needs some corrections, which are detailed in this document. And then they read to me the examiner's feedback. And I remember distinctly the words that Keith Bennett had penned in his feedback. And I can't give it to you word for word perfect, but it went something of this kind. He said that while I have some corrections that are required for the thesis, he went on to comment on its inspirational nature and said that it was the best piece of research he had read in the last 10 years. And when I heard that, I think that was when I suddenly was challenged with the realisation, oh my gosh.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, it was a big deal. That was.
My knowledge of PhDs is very slim, Anthony. However, I do know there are PhDs and PhDs, and I have heard a comment like that once before in my lifetime, and I won't go into that, but it was a similar comment, and it was because it was so useful, right? It was dealing with real stuff, and yeah.
Yep. So I've now got a PhD. A postdoc opened up at university with Professor Murray Patterson, and that was the beginning of another new journey for me. Murray had background in training as an economist and was very interested in the emerging field of ecological economics. So I moved out of kind of a planning, ecology, geography, mathematical modelling background now into the area of economics. That was the next kind of part of the journey for me. And the time I spent with Murray was a really, really good opportunity to get into literature that I'd not engaged with. To me, economics was, I knew it was out there, but I didn't really understand it. And the interesting thing was...
You'd experienced it.
I'd experienced it, but I didn't understand it, no. And it took me some years to acclimatise my thinking and understanding to economic language and to really get inside that. And I struggled with that for quite some time. But eventually I began to formulate some thinking around that. So... At that time, I did a postdoc, got to the end of the postdoc, we kind of ran out of funding, and I moved back into my rural life again.
As a fencer?
I went back into, yes, and taking up whatever work I could get. And, of course, that's when we had moved to Kimbolton by that stage.
Right.
Yeah, so I was living just up the road from you.
Yeah.
I was your neighbour.
Yeah. You were the odd guy that turned up in the neighbourhood.
That's right,
yeah.
I was. And the PhD experience, I think, had raised a really interesting question for me. So here's the deal. A lifetime of this very dysfunctional relationship with education, and completed now 3 degrees at university in 6 years. So I went from no degrees at all in 1990 to being awarded a PhD in theoretical ecology and mathematical modelling at the end of 1996. And when that happened, I think I sat back and pondered to myself, so if that's what you can do with somebody at my age, if you provide them with the right opportunities, what could you do with children if they had access to those opportunities right from the very beginning? In other words, what does an approach to education look like that is, empowering and puts in place what children need to make this journey and to realise their full potential? So when I was in Kimbolton, that's what I was working on with my wife. We were working on trying to rethink the whole process of education and to look at putting in place, what we felt was needed to create success for kids.
Yep, and I remember that because I was chairman of the local primary school, traditional primary school. We were doing a good job. We were operating in the system. And there was a bit of disquiet that this guy had moved into the area to set up a competition school. Or something to what we were doing. And some people were a little bit unsettled by that. I'm not sure if I was. I just found it intriguing, because I've never been interested in education. Go me, the chairman of the school.
School, yes, that's right.
But it was. I wasn't there. I wasn't there for the education. I was there for the other stuff. I thought we had enough. Yeah, but that was my memory of you. That was the thing that you were working on.
It was. So there's another strand, I guess, to this journey that I've just shared with you about education and the time at university. You asked me before, where was the place of safety, the retreat, and about the time that I met my wife, I think. The development of my relationship with her was based around Christianity. So I had that, quite strong grounding in Christianity, and I liked Christianity because it was for me a place of safety.
From what age?
That's a good question. This was 1992, so I was in my early 20s. At that stage.
Right. So it was a new thing.
It was a reasonably new thing for me. Yeah. I'd had some experience with Christianity in the past. My mother was a very devoted Christian, had, taken us in tow to church, as mothers do, as we were growing up as children. And moving around from Air Force Base to Air Force Base, I'd got to know the Air Force version of Christianity through the little chapels on the campus, the places where we used to stay. So I kind of had that background. And when I met my wife, I guess that began developing and growing and took on kind of a life all of its own. So at the time, we kind of crossed paths in Kimbolton. The project that I was working on in Kimbolton was also associated, it was being driven through my relationship with the church. And that came unstuck in I think it was late 1995, early 1996.
With the church or with Christianity?
With the church, yeah. And I think I'd been happy and content in the church. It had been a place of safety for me. And then the church environment that I was in gradually became unsafe. And I found myself confronted with my worst nightmare, my worst fear, which was related all the way back to my relationship with my father and life in the home in an abusive environment.
Yep.
And my reaction to that at the time was a very black and white reaction. I'm an adult now. I put up with that as a kid, but I don't put up with it now. So I drew a line in the sand and said, no, that's it. I'm out. I'm jumping ship. And my wife looked at me with puzzle, I think, when I first mentioned, that idea to her. But I think at the time she could see the struggles, she could see the issues, and she was supportive. So we made the jump, and I left. And that meant leaving the project, and I had a lot invested in that project at the time. So that was a very, very difficult thing to do.
Look, and I do remember that stage, and it seemed, it looked as though it was going to work from the outside. It didn't look like a bit of a project or a hobby. It looked as though it was going to work. Yeah.
Yeah.
From the little we could see. Yeah.
And one of the difficulties, of course, are the legacy that's associated with those early experiences in the home is it's very, very difficult to communicate and talk about those things. And so at the time, I was going through all this inner, emotional turmoil that's associated with me trying to cope with this whole situation, but didn't feel that there was any way that I could talk to other people about that. So,
were you aware of the correlation between the two? Because sometimes people react to things and they don't actually know why they're feeling or why this thing is such a big deal. Did you actually know where that turmoil came from?
I think I did to a certain extent, but I probably understand it better today, I think. Again, hindsight is always 50-50 vision. Yep. Yeah, it is. So, and of course it took some more parts of the journey to shed greater light on this. And, after we left the church and I stepped out of that whole situation, I think there was a sense in which I felt that I'd done the right thing. One thing that it did was it alleviated the pressure, and of course that's always helpful. But of course, then I had to deal with the legacy of, a shift and change in identity. Being involved in the church is not. Yes, I always say that I was not just a Christian, but I was a devoted Christian. Mm-hmm. I believed it, right? So it was a core part of my identity, and then to step away from that is a very, very difficult thing to do. And so it took me in quite a period of adjustment, and I think we tried to get involved in other faith communities and to kind of figure some other angle on this, but actually nothing ever worked for me, and it was a struggle actually for our kids. They'd been brought up, of course, in that environment, and now they went through a period of readjustment as well, which was really hard. And yeah, it didn't connect it. So I had to begin the process now of, creating a new identity. And another interesting twist in the journey, I'm working at Landcare Research by this stage. So I'd been successful in getting a job, and I think this was around the end of the 1990s, around early 2000 by this stage. And this was partly through the support of Murray Patterson, who'd been with me during a postdoc. He'd spotted this opportunity for a job, so I took the job. And Landcare Research was a great place, I think, to work, and was a very, very supportive environment for me. But what I found was that I was struggling with the relationship with the church through all of this, and I was also trying to figure out who I was as an academic. And I think I mentioned this to you the other day. When you go through the academic system, you do a PhD, you normally do that at about the age of 19, 20. Right? It's by the time you graduate. So I've graduated, but I've come in as a much older student. And so I now had the challenge of adjusting to the institutional science system as well as an older person. And that was difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was behind the ball.
And so you've got the struggle with that. You've got the struggle with the church.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm just reflecting on your life at this point, Anthony. There hasn't been many comfortable zones for you. I listened to this story, and by now, the 2000s, you'd be about 40, and there's been no comfort in your life.
I think there was, the place of safety for me was my relationship with my wife and our family. That was a real solid foundation. Without that, the journey, I don't think would have been successful. So, yeah, just really want to acknowledge that. And a struggle for my wife, I think, because, you know, I'm one out of the box. This is not the way people normally do things. It's hard to kind of see where all of this is going, and I think to live through struggles of that kind and to maintain faith in another person is something that's really challenging.
Yeah.
And she successfully managed to do that while going through her own process of adjustment in all of this as well. And, you know, I think today we still have a pretty remarkable, you know, relationship together, and you know, that's a credit to her, I have to say. It hasn't been easy.
No, that's the thing is, you know, when I listen to this journey so far and go, that's the thing that stands out for me, is that it's sort of, you know, you found your place in Kimbolton but didn't work out, and then you had to pull out of that situation, which is almost like a divorce.
It was. Yes.
So it's none of that is easy. So then, and so I'd like to just move forward from that point to where you are now. How did you get? Because the biggest change I see is still to come in your life in this story.
It was. I was working at Landcare Research and sitting in the office there in Palmerston North, and got a call on the phone from one of my relations in Otaki, whose name is Whatarangi Winiata. And he spoke to me on the phone and popped the question and said, what would you think about the idea of moving to Te Raukawa and taking up a teaching position here?
So what's intriguing for me, Anthony, in this story, this is the first time you have mentioned any reference to Māori.
That is correct. And this is, I guess, another layer to this journey. Actually, when in my early childhood, my father started his Air Force career at Ohakea Air Force Base, and we kind of moved back and forward to Ohakea, and during the time we spent there, which I think was probably the happiest time for my parents in terms of their marriage, we had quite a close relationship with my father's relations in Otaki. And I remember as a child, being put in the car and, you know, driven down to Otaki for the weekend to visit the relations, and being left with the aunts and uncles, you know, overnight while my parents would go off to the local dance hall. I remember, you know, the family occasions with my relations in Otaki. And I must say those early experiences are constantly an important touchstone for me, because I have memories there of Māori culture that I don't see today. It was a Māori culture that I associated with integrity and with warmness and with generosity and with safety, that is such a contrast to so much of what I experience today. So that was there. You're right, there's this big gap in the middle, and that gap was partly because from Ohakea Air Force Base we got shipped off to Singapore, and then from Singapore we got shipped to the South Island, and I lost that connection. And so with a doctorate, of course, and working at Landcare Research, Whatarangi was keen for me to come and spend time at Te Raukawa. And bear in mind, Te Raukawa had come as one of the three wānanga within New Zealand who had come into existence as a part of the liberalising of the Tomorrow's School, liberalising the university educational legislation. And it was a wonderful project, and I acknowledge that for what it was. I remember sitting in front of Whatarangi one day, and his wife Francie, we were sitting there and having this conversation. I said to Whata, look, thank you very much for this offer. And I prepared this little presentation for him, and I sort of said, well, look, I think there's three options here. One option is that I could come to Te Raukawa straight away. The other option is that I don't come. And then there's kind of an option here in the middle where, what about if we just carry on, you know, building a relationship and doing some little projects together until we get to know each other a bit better, and then maybe at some time in the future I'll make the jump to Te Raukawa. Now, why did I have that conversation? I did that because I didn't know if I was capable of making such a jump. The only education and training I had was in a Western science institution. To jump then into teaching and taking on responsibilities in a tikanga Māori educational context, I didn't know what that involved, and I didn't know whether or not I was capable of making such a jump. So, anyway, I remember whatarangi once again. It was people like leaning over their glasses, you know, and he leaned over his glass and looked down at the table and he said, "Oh, I like that option there. You're coming straight away."
Oh, I knew that was coming.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I asked for that. So anyway, okay, right, that's all on. I put in my notice and I'm off to Ngāti Raukawa. And I want to say that was a remarkably generous offer. Now, one of the reasons that, and I said this to whatarangi, I said one of the reasons that I felt comfortable in engaging and working with whatarangi was because it was that early touchstone of my early childhood experiences with our whānau and Otaki. And I saw and I sensed in whatarangi what I experienced with them. It was the generosity.
Yeah.
And so I felt comfortable working with whatarangi. And so we started, and I hadn't been at Te Wānanga Raukawa, I think, more than a week, and Mike Ross, who was the kaihotu for the Masters of Māori Management program at Te Wānanga Raukawa, came up to me and he said, "Look, now you've got a background in ecological economics and etc., you know, and we have this master's program that has some economics papers in it that were being taught by a university lecturer from Victoria University. But he has to leave and there's no one to teach these programs. Our students have been struggling with it. There's 2 papers in economics. I think one was called Economic Analysis and the other one was called Economic Performance. And so, could you teach these papers?" And I thought, oh my gosh, you know, my love relationship with economics, I really had such difficulty getting my head around this stuff. So, okay, so I agreed and, took up this position of teaching these economics papers. Now, I tell you that story because this was the beginnings, really, of my journey in Māori Genuine Progress Indicator accounting. It started in those lectures.
Okay, just say that slowly, please, okay? It's your journey into?
Māori Genuine Progress Indicator accounting.
Okay. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that.
We'll come back to that one.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
It's a mouthful.
It is. So the lecturer who had been from Victoria University who'd been teaching there before me had been teaching really just, you know, economic textbook material to the students, and Māori students were struggling with it. There was a real relevance issue. So I set myself to the task initially with trying to figure out, well, what is the relevance of economic thinking to Māori culture? And so, you know, tried to rethink and to reframe the teaching program from that perspective. And so I set myself to that task. I was very interested, of course. Computer technology had been very empowering for me. And one of the issues that our students at Te Wānanga Raukawa grappled with was the learning journey. And one of the things I'd found very helpful at university was being able to slow the learning process down to a speed at which I could actually cope with and manage with it. And when I could do that, I was successful. And I did that using technology. So here's another little aside for you. So in my last year of my first degree, I took 2 papers in the science department. One of them was plant biology and the other one was whole plant physiology, I think. And I took these papers because I was interested in ecology and plants, and they seemed like, you know, interesting papers. I remember sitting there in the lecture, the very, very first lecture, and the lecturer was up on the whiteboard. He spent the entire lecture putting chemical equations up on the whiteboard, and I thought to myself, what have I done? Oh my gosh. And this is my last year. I've got to get this degree finished, and I've got these 2 papers now. So the coping strategy was I went out and gathered together some money and purchased a little cassette recorder. I used to keep the cassette recorder there with me in the lecture theatre. I recorded the lectures. I went back over them afterwards. And I took down the notes from the whiteboard. And by going back over it, I could slow it down and to go over it again and again until I got it. So I got to the end of the year and got the highest grades in both of those papers. I was the top student. And led me to realise that there is an issue. It's not that people can't learn. Actually, all of us are capable of learning. That it's providing the learning environment that makes it possible for us to learn. It's moving those barriers out of the way. So when I got to Te Wānanga o Raukawa, I set myself to try to do that for our Māori students, and created e-learning resources. That was kind of emerging at that stage. And the economics program, I think, was reasonably successful. It was enjoyed by the students. I think they engaged for the most part with the learning resources really well. They, again, found that easy to use those resources to help them with their learning journey, and we started getting the grades up. So, the students were getting through those papers, so that was great. Now, the time at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, I think, opened up another couple of possibilities for me. Whatarangi was very interested in something that he called Kaupapa accounting. He'd come from a background, his own PhD from Ann Arbor in the States, had been in the area of accounting, and he was very interested in applying that to measuring the well-being of Māori communities and the Māori nation. And this connected shortly after I arrived at Te Wānanga o Raukawa with a conversation that was going on inside the Māori Party at that time. And I think Whatarangi was probably quite influential in terms of stimulating and guiding that conversation, but he certainly had the other members of the caucus on board with him, Peter Sharples, I think, in particular. So the Māori Party had been looking at the GDP accounting system, and they recognised that GDP did not do a great job of measuring the annual contribution of the Māori treaty partner towards this country. We needed a better accounting system. At that time, what was happening internationally was the development of a new accounting system called Genuine Progress Indicator Accounting, GPI accounting. So the Māori Party located one of the world's leading scholars in this area, Ron Coleman, and brought him out here to New Zealand. He did a roadshow across the country, did a whole series of presentations trying to create interest in this area of genuine progress indicator accounting. And I think at the end of that journey, they topped it off with a conference at Takapuahi Marae in Porirua, New Zealand's first genuine progress indicator accounting conference. And Whatarangi, of course, I'd just arrived at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, had been by that stage involved in another modelling project in my work at Landcare Research, which is based in the Nelson Tasman regions, where I'd been working on an implementation of the genuine progress indicator accounting work. So Whata was keen for me to give a presentation, which I did at that conference. And I look back to that conference now as quite another important part of the journey for me, because I was really fascinated with this idea of what an alternative accounting system could look like. And at the time, I think the Māori Party, the members of the Māori Party, thought that we could pick up the GPI accounting framework, we could add some Māori indicators to it, and we'd have something that we could use to more effectively measure the contribution of the Māori treaty partner. It wasn't that simple. I had an initial go at it while I was at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, and I think I began to realise that even at that stage that there was a lot more to this. And it's been a 15-year journey to get that one now to the stage where we have this thing I was talking about before called Māori Genuine Progress Indicator Accounting, and I'll come back to that at a later time. So the journey at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, I think, was an important opportunity now for me to reconnect with my Māori cultural identity. And that was a real journey of reconnection. As I said, apart from those early childhood experiences, this was very new ground for me. And I have to say that even though I really enjoyed working at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, it was an awkward space to be in. It really was. Now, let me give you the kind of picture of this. Again, it was kind of a misalignment issue in terms of where I was up to in my kind of career development. I'd come very late. I had come through the Western University system. Te Wānanga o Raukawa, as with all of the wānanga, I think at that time, was on a journey of decolonisation and trying to be involved in opening conversations that were more critical of, the whole colonial influence and confronting that. And so I got myself again into an unsafe situation. And that was because I came into Te Raukawa with the best of intentions, but I was clumsy. I've described this to other people before, like a little bit like an unwieldy animal in a china shop, really. I was going around doing my best not to get into trouble, but every now and again I'd knock a table and some plates would go flying. And, and why was I doing that? It was because I didn't really understand the context in which I was trying to work.
And you look very Pākehā.
That, and of course, I come from a Western scientific background.
Yeah.
To add to my faults.
Yeah.
Yes. So it was awkward. And I got to the end of the journey at Te Raukawa and felt that had been a really, really important time for me. But once again, I felt like it was time to move on. So I left Te Raukawa and began working after that in another tikanga Māori context. My daughter, while I was at Te Raukawa, my daughter who had finished her high school years, had completed the training program for ministry candidates being run at Te Raukawa by the Māori side of the Anglican Church. And this was training Minata'a iwi, providing a degree program training for him. And because she'd been brought up in that Christian environment and I was working in that space now, she was actually really interested in this. And I said, okay, so I gave her my support and away she went. So Elizabeth completed the Paumanua qualification and I got involved in that to a certain extent. And then eventually, after she had finished, began working for the Pīopatanga, the Māori side of the Anglican Church, looking after their master's teaching program. And Elizabeth today has a beautiful command of the Māori language of all of us in the family. She's the one who's the most fluent and has a fascinating insight into Māori culture that was a part of that journey for her. So I spent another 2 years working with the students in the master's program that had been developed. And Bishop Muru Walters at that time wanted to develop this program onto a PhD doctoral program. So I was working there trying to help and support them with that. And that was, I think, another really important part of the journey for me. The time that I spent with the students in the Pīopatanga, the master's students in particular, was very healing for me, and it opened my understanding to aspects of Māori culture that I'd not had access to before, and I found that absolutely fascinating. And I have said this to other people before, that I think of my entire academic career, the 2 years in the Pīopatanga was probably the most productive and fertile time of my entire academic career. It was a really, really important launch pad. But again, it came to another awkward end, and for very similar reasons to those that I mentioned before. I just have this uncomfortable relationship with Christianity. It just doesn't work. And looking back, I think that's probably just partly a reflection of who I am. And again, this gradual coming to awareness of who I am, which I still hadn't completely got hold of at that time. And one of the things that I realise now is that I'm not your typical student. I'm not your typical academic.
Anthony, that 2 years sounds like a period of true transition for you.
It was. Yeah.
That's when you were talking about that. All the other stuff was learning, but not transition. Where this was a combination of the two. And it would be interesting to know how much you changed through that time. I think it would be quite a lot.
Oh, it was, and I think it was healing in the sense that it helped me to calm down. I took the kind of stress levels down a few levels because I was once again in an environment with other people where I was comfortable. I wasn't threatened, and when you can put me into a space of that kind, I'm away. Yeah. So from there, And I think the time with the Pioopatanga was the launch pad really for the journey with the Māori Genuine Progress Indicator accounting, which I now kind of had in my line of sights, had done some initial work in getting this going, but it needed more time. So I picked up a job after the Pioopatanga in the back at Massey University and worked there for a little while, I think probably not too much more than a year or so, but I just struggled to settle back into an institutional context, and that didn't work for me. So I had a friend who I had acquaintance initially, but a person who became a close friend, who said to me, look, why don't you come up to Tauranga? We're trying to get some project activities going up there. You've got a background in, Māori cultural approaches to this kind of work. We'd love to have you. So we moved once again to Tauranga. And the time in Tauranga was an important launch pad for me, I think, just in terms of, again, helping me to settle down into a place where I felt confident, and the Māori Genuine Progress Indicator accounting work really began to flourish there. We got funding for a 2-year project with Aotearoa, and at the end of that 2-year project, which I think was in 2019 now, we had the first working prototype of an alternative to the national GDP accounting system. And that was the end of a very long journey, and with a lot of twists and turns in between. But that was really cool. And I think that had been made possible partly, I just want to acknowledge this, because of the work of my son Aaron, who is working at Niwa in Auckland. He's a software engineer. And Aaron him and I back in 2001, I remember sitting at home in our garage, spreading out these sheets of paper, on the table, and I had this thinking and idea about how we could develop an approach, a software platform that we could use for what you today call collective intelligence. And we didn't have the technology available at that time to kind of put the idea into implementation, but he had worked with me through this journey, and we'd got to the stage in 2019 where he'd actually managed to produce a working prototype of this platform, and that was really cool to have got to that stage. So we get this platform going, and I'm writing more funding applications, and it's a bit of a hit and miss process with funding applications. So sometimes you get funding, sometimes you don't. So I think it was 3 or 4 funding applications later, and I was successful in getting funding, not within Rotorua, which is where I'd been working with Aotearoa, but over here within Heretaunga. And that was what provided the opportunity for me to move here to Heretaunga to begin working. We had another 2 years of funding to socialise the Māori Genuine Progress Indicator accounting project here with representatives from Marae and Hapu, and that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years.
And how do they accept that, Anthony? How do you get the funding?
Yes.
You've got this model, but how does the local iwi Hapu respond to you?
Yes, so my first point of contact for working here within Heretaunga was in 2016. I'm at home, and I got a phone call one evening from one of our whānau here within Heretaunga, a beautiful young Māori woman by the name of Jenny Major, and I didn't know Jenny from Bar Soap. I just got this phone call, and she said to me, "I'm Jenny Major." I said, "Hello, Jenny Major," and she said to me, she told me a little bit about what they were doing, and said, "Would you be prepared to come and help work with us?" So they had found me.
They invited you?
Yes, they invited me. And through doing a little bit of asking around, and I think possibly through a contact at Massey University, someone had indicated to them that I was probably someone who could help them. So I came over here, there's an initial point of contact, and the members of the Regional Council at that time invited me to undertake a social and cultural assessment as a part of the Tank Plan Change project, which is what Jenny and the others were working on, Manawhena were working on at that time, and that's what they wanted help with. So that provided the point of entry into a conversation here and provided the opportunity really for building relationships. And that started in 2016, so it took some time between then and when we finally got the funding to get the MGPI accounting socialisation project up and running, which I think was in 2020. Yes, and we've spent the last 2 years. We're coming to the end of the 2 years now. So it takes time, and I think that's one of the defining characteristics of working in a Māori community context. Sometimes Western scientists have asked me, how do I've got some funding, I'd like to work with hapu or with a Māori community, how do I do this? And, my suggestion always is put the funding aside, don't concentrate on the funding in the meantime, go to work on expressing generosity towards your Māori community. Get to know them, become a seen face, build relationships. And of course that takes time, but if you can put that time in, that will open doors and opportunities for you in working with your desired Māori community long term that will remain firmly shut if you try and run a project of this kind from a financial perspective. Yeah.
And how many people have made that mistake trying to bowl up with the best intentions?
Yes,
and,
that's right.
And just have that door not open. So, could this program you're working on work just not for Māori, but could it work for other communities as well?
Yes, I think it could. So the Genuine Progress Indicator accounting framework is now well established internationally, and I guess over the last 15 years there's a couple of important changes that we've managed to make. The GPI accounting framework is an attempt to correct well-known inadequacies in GDP accounting, and it's important to acknowledge those, I think. But one of the blind spots in the GPI accounting framework is that it fails to explore and to quantify the impact of economic activity on culture. And that, after I had finished the work in the Nelson Tasman regions, this was in my time at Landcare Research, that was a defining discovery for me. I had a fantastic accounting system that I developed that, gave remarkable resolution in the ecological, economic and social well-being areas, but the cultural was missing. So one of the things that we've managed to do over the last 15 years is to better understand how to bring cultural well-being into the measurement process, and also measurement of the journey towards Māori community cultural survival. And that's important. But when I use the expression cultural survival, I think, we hear this so often today that we've tended to become a little bit immune to the deeper meaning of this expression. And it's important perhaps just to pause and give a little bit of context around this idea of cultural survival. In 2016, I did some work as a part of publishing a paper, and the figures that I came up with at that time, which are based on international research, suggest that there was at that time a documented 6,900 living languages in existence, I think, at that time, which is the good news. Each one of those living languages internationally represents at least one distinctive cultural identity. So we can say there's at least 6,900 distinctive cultural identities in the world. The bad news is that this research also evidenced that the annual average rate of language extinction is about one every 3 months, which means that within the next 100 years, we're currently on track to lose somewhere between 60 to 90% of the world's linguistic and cultural diversity, depending on how the global community responds to this human cultural extinction crisis. So cultural survival is not a given today. actually, if we do nothing, and given that we're very preoccupied with COVID-19 right at the moment, and with global climate change, and now a war in Ukraine and everything else, if the global community does nothing, the long-term prospect is not great for cultural survival. So the 15-year journey was also about trying to really get some clarity on not only what culture is, but what cultural survival actually looks like, so that this can actually be integrated into an accounting system.
Why is it important to keep all these cultures alive?
Yes, I think you can answer that question from a number of different perspectives. Perhaps one perspective is that there's a utility. This would be perhaps the economic perspective on this, that is often cited in the literature, that Indigenous peoples, Indigenous cultures are able to contribute through their accumulated wisdom and learning toward the well-being of the planet. So perhaps this is a utilitarian reason for doing that. My own reason, I think, for cultural survival is that I'm fascinated by culture. It's beautiful, it's colourful, it's wildly creative, and I guess the thing for me is, why wouldn't you want to, nurture and look after that remarkable cultural diversity that we have, and to make it possible for that to survive and find expression long term. And this comes now, of course, to a much deeper part of my own journey and trying to work through all of these issues and I guess forming some thinking around where we are at this time. Yeah.
Anthony, switching focus slightly, the book that Tina Jenin got you to read.
Yes.
What was the learning? What happened when you read that?
So firstly, I hesitated a little bit on that before. So Tina had an audio version of the book, and it's a very, very long book to get through. And one of the reasons it was accessible for me was because driving back and forward between Tauranga and Hastings, I had time to sit and listen to it. And I think I've been through it at least 3 times now.
And before I get onto that, one of the things that struck me before, Anthony, is that you have moved, your family is still based up in Tauranga. You have moved down here. You're
Yes.
based here 10 days in a row or something like that, then you go back. 12 days in a row, then you go back to Tauranga. One of the things that struck me through this conversation is when you commit to something, you're in boots and all. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's something that's, and, the thing is, you're down here, we're in your studio here in Central Hawke's Bay, surrounded by all your gear, and you have been based here for how long?
Yes, since early January this year.
And then you have been commuting backwards and forwards for how long?
For nearly 2 years now.
Yeah. And that is not an easy commute.
That's not an easy commute.
No.
Yeah, it's a long way to go.
I just wanted to give that context.
Yes.
So driving backwards and forwards from Tauranga to Hastings, right, on your commute, what did you learn?
Yes, the book, The Gifted Adult by Elaine Jacobs, is a book that it spoke to me in a way that no other book of that kind that I've engaged with has. It was a little bit like I felt like what the author was describing was actually describing me. And that was an unusual experience because she was describing aspects of me that I wasn't even really, completely conscious of myself, but certainly not comfortable with sharing with other people. And so it was a little bit like engaging with a mirror. And one of her reasons for writing this book is because in her career as a psychologist, she became aware that there are people who have gifts who don't realise that they have gifts. They don't fit easily into the offerings that we have in terms of the education system. And so even though they are very gifted, they don't necessarily provide evidence of being gifted. And actually, if you look back at my journey, early educational journey, you would be forgiven for, drawing conclusions of that kind. In fact, I think I told you, after I had been awarded my PhD, I sat down with my mother, had a conversation one day with her about this, and she reminded me that when we were living in Christchurch, we'd just come back from Singapore, and I was in my school certificate year at high school at this stage. She'd gone to visit the mathematics teacher, and she reminded me that he'd kind of shook his head with a disappointed look on his face and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Cole, it's not too much hope for your son in terms of getting school certificate mathematics." Yes. And she said, and here you are now, with a PhD in mathematical modelling. Yeah, so I think that it was interesting for me to come to the realisation that such a situation exists. I didn't realise that other people shared that same experience, and that this author had written this book sharing the experiences that come from her years of working as a psychologist with a real passionate interest in this area, to help people like myself go through a process of self-realisation and awakening to who they actually are. Now, Tina eventually managed to get me a printed copy of the book, and in the book is a self-scoring survey that you can take that can be used to a form of self-assessment in terms of where you sit, in terms of what the author describes as evolutionary intelligence. So we can get onto a conversation about intelligence, that's another conversation, but let's just hold that as a given for the moment. So I sat down, having been through the book a few times, and took the survey, and to my surprise discovered that I scored really, really high on that evolutionary intelligence.
So just briefly, what is that?
So evolutionary intelligence, of course, there are different types of intelligence, and the theory of multiple intelligences, the work of educational psychologist Howard Gardner, I think has really opened up a much broader conversation in this area. Evolutionary intelligence, some people have the capacity to contribute towards changes that result in very significant leaps being made that have tremendous impacts in terms of well-being for other people. And not everyone can do that. So someone who has evolutionary intelligence has the capacity to contribute towards dramatic, rapid change of that kind. And evolutionary intelligence is associated with a core set of skills that are common with people who share capability in this area. One of them is they have a very strong drive. Yeah? They have the capacity to grapple with complexity, and they're undaunted in terms of their efforts to achieve things. So they have a capacity to work through processes of trial and error, and to do it again and again and again and again until they finally get to the place where they break through. Now, that capacity to do things by trial and error is actually crucial to evolutionary intelligence, because bear in mind that creating shift of that kind requires a breadth of knowledge and understanding, requires alignment with thinking and ideas that you can't achieve in a short space of time. It's the consolidation of years of patient, painstaking, persistent effort that brings all of those parts into a planetary alignment that makes possible that final contribution. So the book, I think, helped me to come to terms, finally, all these years later, 60 years later, with a greater realisation of who I was. And I realise now that that's why I had such difficulty with the education system. You see, if you look at my early education system, we moved all the time. So my education was constantly disrupted. I never had the opportunity to settle down long enough for the evolutionary capabilities that I had to actually be consistently applied. So I'd start doing it, it was interrupted. And so thanks to David Longley and Roger Douglas, I find myself at university with no other option than to study.
It's interesting. I have a good friend who I'm holding a party for the next month or so, and the party is to celebrate 40 years of failure, and that 40 years of failure has eventuated in just a stunning piece of work that's coming to light now. And when I say failure, lots of things he's done has succeeded, but haven't stuck or haven't been with the right people or whatever. So he's done lots and lots of things, but been continually frustrated that people couldn't quite keep up with him, and he, And now this, after all of that grapple, is coming up with the most amazing genetic evolutionary, in the food sector. And
Fantastic.
This is a guy that struggled like hell at school, right? And left early, and and when you're talking about that, I talked to him recently about this evolutionary intelligence, because he's got all those attributes there, right? And through a different lens would not be considered intelligent, and
Yes.
often talks about himself as not being intelligent, which I get frustrated with him and tell him to wind his neck, and it's just a very narrow view of intelligence. But those things you're talking about, and the fact that he is as enthusiastic now at the age of 63 as when he was 23 about sheep, right? Now, you have got to be seriously fucked up to be that excited after 40 years with sheep. And, so we're holding to celebrate 40 years of failure and getting this gem up and going, and it's going to be fascinating to see
That is
where it goes from here.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And I think it's a really important point, Anthony, because, how many adults don't quite appreciate who they are?
Who they are.
Because the system's never recognised it.
Yes. And this is the very point that Mary Elaine Jacobs is making in her book. And when we allow that to happen, when we don't put in place the social institutions and structures that make it possible to nurture, giftedness of this kind, our communities, the world misses out on what could have been. So I found that personally very challenging, and I think that's probably a reflection also of the work that I do in a Māori community context. I'm really passionate about removing the barriers to Māori cultural achievement and making it possible for the members of Māori communities to have around them the opportunities and the tools and the learning and the support and the encouragement that they need to achieve and to be who they are. So that's an important part of the Māori Genuine Progress Indicator accounting work and what we're trying to achieve. You asked me before about the relevance of that work. So Māori Genuine Progress Indicator accounting started obviously as an attempt to understand what genuine progress indicator accounting could look like in a multicultural context. It's taken 15 years to iron the creases out of that and to get it to the stage where I think we've got a pretty exciting tool and product now. And some good news from the last week. I've just heard that MB has very graciously given us now a third round of funding to continue the development of this project for another 2 years. And I was absolutely delighted to hear that because I really needed another 2 years to get this through the implementation stage of what we're doing here. So that's fantastic. And I think that this work is of relevance and importance not only to Māori communities but to every Indigenous community that is struggling with these same issues around the planet. And one of the things I found very interesting in our conversations that we've had together has been an awakening, and this is a new awakening for me, to the realization that the community that you've created around collective intelligence has so many similarities and connections with the work that I'm doing in a Māori community context. And that's actually a new discovery for me, because I wasn't aware of that potential outside of a Māori community context. That's where I've been working. And that's really opened, I think, now an interesting question for me, being the very curious person that I am. And the question is, how could Māori Genuine Progress Indicator be adopted in a community context of the kind that you're working? Because I think what I'm beginning to realise is that actually we're all grappling with the same issues. It's not just Indigenous communities that are grappling with these issues. There's a journey of empowerment that is also a part of what you're doing. And that excites me.
And Anthony, it's interesting when you first raised that, I remember the heart palpitations I had at that point, because it's something that I have always dreamt of when we look at what the ripples happen within collective intelligence and how they intersect and these different pebbles drop at different times and they intersect, and thinking if we could just grasp what those ripples are doing and understand them and then try and multiply them and grow them. And I've got to say, I thought I was going to go to my grave not knowing that. And so when you started talking about that, I just went, oh man, this could be just a game changer for us to actually understand. Because my frustration with our work is that people do not quite understand the power of the subtle changes when they compound what they actually create.
Yes.
And it's interesting that you and I are going to a breakfast in a few weeks' time, and with wonderful work here in Hawke's Bay with Prima Volta, and they've had their work assessed. For every dollar they spent, they came back with a number, and they said it was a bit smaller than they expected. And I said, well, that's because the number's bullshit, because they just are not able to grasp the enormity of what you're doing. Right? And they're grasping the things that are tangible, but the intangible are far greater than that. And that's been my frustration with collective intelligence.
Gotcha.
Anthony, we're going to wrap up soon. And I thought, the way you've brought it together at the end there, because I was going to ask about your work in the future, but, you've just touched on that, and congratulations on the funding. And a shout out to EMB,
yes,
for actually sticking with this, because I don't have a hard evidence. I don't think they fund things 3 times. That would be pretty rare.
No, that is unusual. And yes, this is the third round of funding that they've given us for this project. So that's a tremendous privilege. Yeah,
well done, MB, for doing that.
Yeah.
Anthony, anything you want to finish off on?
No, I think I've enjoyed our conversation today. I've enjoyed the opportunity to spend time with you exploring my own journey, and that's not something that I've really had the opportunity to do before, and I think that's been helpful. So thank you for that.
And Anthony, I mean, you're an addictive bugger because, you know, the number of times we've sat down, we've never had a short conversation yet. And long may that last. So, Anthony, thank you for your work. And I am looking forward to working with you more in the future. As I said, we've worked out we've got more in common than not. And our differences are vast, which I love. And our similarities are very similar in other respects.
Yes.
Yeah. So well done. Keep up the great work, Anthony.
Thank you.
Looking forward to the next steps.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks for listening in. We're Collective Intelligence, a one-of-a-kind people ecosystem that takes inspiration from Mother Nature. To find out how we reimagine leadership development, visit our website www.collectiveintelligence.co.nz.